Showtime.
So when are you going to Savannah?
I tried to get a reservation. Try to get it.
You should have done it about a year ago.
Should have done a lot of things.
Yeah, all restaurants are like that.
Yeah. And I
We got any kind of reservation?
Oh, we did, there he is.
Very nice. Saturday.
What about
I don't have a reservation. So, but
Call the meeting to order. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, the city in which we live. Guide us this afternoon as we make any decisions. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
This is the Newnan City's Council special call meeting on June the 13th, 2023 for the express purpose of continuing our discussion of 57 East project. Today we have with us a gentleman from Historical Concepts. Good to see you all again. Appreciate that. I'm going to call on Mr. Craver. This is a work session, by the way, and not actually a public hearing. I'm going to call on Mr. Craver to reintroduce our team that we first met down in
Thank you,
Thomasville.
Mayor Grady, members of the council. We do have with us our guests, so we're not meeting for the first time, but we're very excited to see them for the second or third time. With us, we have Ryan, Kevin, Matt. I'll allow them to kind of come up and reintroduce themselves or get us kicked off, but as they're doing that and approaching the podium, I will hand out a paper, hard copy of the presentation they're going to lead you guys through here. So, gentlemen.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
And this presentation will be made available to the public online once we finish the meeting tonight, so you'll be able to go on and link up to that.
Thank you all. And, again, Kevin Clark from Historical Concepts. With me, Ryan Yerkeba from Historical Concepts as well, Matt Schaefer as well. So appreciate the opportunity to come back and see y'all. This is a recap of the presentation and work session that we worked through with y'all during the retreat. And so wanted to take the opportunity now for the next few minutes and just sort of run through a little recap of what we did together and then some suggestions for the council here as we move forward. So with that, I think we were really tasked with, with helping lead y'all sort of in the decision-making process. The very first question that we asked was sort of what was the purpose of our time together, and I think the overwhelming sentiment there was that the purpose was define the next best step. What's the next best step for 57 East? And so, or 57 East Broad, I'm sorry. So what we have outlined here in the middle of the page on the right is the action items. We feel like these action items are that next best step. The first one being, we recommend the city council endorse a vision for the site. And we'll talk about what we heard or what we believe we heard that vision was in just a second. Immediately after that, after they have that vision, the council should determine what degree of public investment will determine the site's outcome. And obviously a big piece of that is the convention center, whether that's a piece of the project. And then third, assembling a marketing document to solicit the desired kind of development based on those points above, including stating goals of priorities, developer controls, developer plan approvals, which we'll recommend later. So that vision, we feel like, was a really key element. We talked about that a lot. We talked about, obviously, a lot of things. But we felt like that vision was really key, and if everybody could sort of gain consensus, if council gained consensus on what a vision is, we feel like that might be a guiding North Star to then answer the rest of the questions that are going to come at you as you endeavor to potentially develop or sell what happens on the rest of the property. So the vision that we heard was that the end result should be timeless, a seamless evolution of old to new, including streets, buildings, and impressions. New activity on the site should stimulate collateral growth in downtown Newnan in a sensitive and successful way. And consistently, we heard the terms authentic, sustainable, and adaptable. We felt like those were sort of three North Star words that we heard again and again from council. So again, ask you all as you sort of take this in, recognizing this is the first time you're seeing this since our retreat. I ask you all obviously to think about that, and not that you have to adopt that vision statement, but we would encourage you all to think about creating a vision statement, either built off of that or in the direction of it, or if you like how we wrote it, you can just take it as is. Next, obviously, we had a lot of discussion about site program, and so we can go through this in heavy detail or light detail, but I think I might just hit the highlights. There was a lot of discussion about preferred type of development. I think actually program was important, but maybe secondary to aesthetics is what we heard, and that was pretty consistent throughout the retreat meeting that we had. So just want to hit a few highlights, starting in the middle page there, top of the middle, streets framework. I think it was pretty consistent commentary that we heard that, new streets should connect the existing neighborhoods, and more successfully connecting downtown with streets and sidewalks. The new development should address all public frontages. There's not a front and a back to the property. There's frontages all around, and potentially even internally all around, if new streets are added into the project. There's a consensus opinion that some open space is important to the site. An opinion that the open space could be incorporated, potentially in a 1 acre parcel on the northeast of the site. Public space was requested to be very intentional with multi-functionality. There was discussion of a hotel potential on the property, and I think, with the rest of the pieces, the streets framework and the park open space, I think we feel like those were sort of musts. The rest of these elements, we don't think you're going to be able to put all this on the property. So these are just more sort of thought starters for if something like this happens, if a potential for these types of uses. If a hotel use has the market support, then obviously there's some value consensus of how that might be shaped. Concept of the convention center was the next piece. The ability to affect this site potentially with that convention center, how might that fit in? That was a site program that a number of people were interested in. We talked about a parking deck as a program element that takes up a large chunk. Obviously, may also be required depending upon the intensity of development that occurs. Residential use, we talked a lot about the potential for residential use. I think for sale residential got unanimous support with a preference towards maybe attached townhouses or a condominium building. Very little support for rent residential. And we know right now, based on previous analysis, that very few residences have been put into the downtown district in the last decade. Retail, again, sounds like, obviously not sounds like, we know Newnan has a great, a strong soft goods retail presence today. Certainly, more could be good. Same with restaurant, great restaurant scene today. Obviously a viable likelihood for more restaurants. And office was another use we consistently heard was a good potential. Yeah, we highlighting that photo on the bottom left there before we leave this page. That was the concept that we shared during the retreat, which was really just sort of a cut and paste of some of the blocks that you already have. And the idea there that we really wanted to show was just the idea of sort of replicating the scale of the squares around the courthouse, and effectively sort of copy pasting them and how that may look to continue the grid that you already have here in Newnan to kind of continue to build it out as it was historically built. Building character was the next key, and we didn't highlight all the images that we shared together, but we kind of hit I think sort of the top 8 or 9, and then also the bottom 4 were ones that got really sort of least ratings as we went through that. So building character was of great concern. And again, I mentioned that before. There was a lot of desire for flexibility of building use over time. Use was really secondary to form and aesthetic. And so what did we hear about that? You know, the architectural character of new buildings should heavily resemble the historic ones. We think we heard that pretty consistently. The form of the development, again, more important than specific uses. Facade design as it comes in should instill a variety in design such that new buildings appear to have been built in an incremental fashion with varied design approaches. And the vision was to have a mix of building heights. We heard everything from sort of 2 to 6 stories. I think obviously the vast majority of that being 2 and 3, but we heard a majority of people saying, a 4 or even a 6-story building might be acceptable in this area. And a big key was that building details mattered. Cornices, window shapes and treatments, entries, shading devices, balconies. Again and again, we heard that was really key to the new development of 57 East. So then we come to a few recommendations, and some of these we mentioned while we were together, taking the time to run through these now as our guidance based on what we heard. So taking action, feel like that's critical. Doing nothing is not an option. I believe we heard that from you all. We agree and encourage you that the planning process should continue with the expectation that the first occupant would be there within 5 years. Again, that was based on your feedback. Knowing that construction processes take a while, planning processes take a while, action needs to happen if you hope that somebody's there using the site in 5 years. But, with that said, council still reserves the right to stop the process if it's moving in the wrong direction, as I think, again, why we think that vision statement is so important, so that you all have that, collective North Star that you can go back to and say, hey, this path is no longer hitting this vision. We got to pull back and revisit or tack back towards the vision. Obviously, we encourage you to value the land, realize the investment and value that you put into date, leverage it wisely. Obviously, that gives you the opportunity to possibly discount the price of the land, we'd say for the right developers, for the right development. And, consider selling portions as opposed to the entire parcel. I think that's another recommendation we have. Obviously, some of these may go without saying, but incentives, be prudent with employing development incentives available to the city, and also think outside of the box. We do think thinking like a developer is key. Set your own terms, be savvy, state the limitations and obligations of the developer. You all are in the position of having a very desirable town, a very desirable site. You can kind of set the table for what you want to see, and I think people will fall in line. Make development controls part of the land sale. We think that's key. You guys told us again and again that design is important. Make those part of the land sale. Prescribe the form and the placement of the buildings. The land use we heard was less critical. So prescribe the aesthetic desires and materials for the projects. Those are all things as part of the development control we recommend. And, one more development control, consider all the parking to be city-owned to ensure that benefit of parking is shared by multiple uses, and not just one individual property owner. And in terms of development or developer plan approvals, we recommend you clearly outline the approval process and requirements for future developers. This may include even a special design review process. But part of that could be ensuring a swift timeline if guidance is followed. Let people see that path of least resistance if they simply follow the directions that you all have set out. And one of those ways could be offering a case manager to respond to the development needs. So this second piece of recommendations is also a little bit of where we heard some challenges and then some suggestions. So a further recommendation, we sort of divided these into 5 subsets. One is for rent housing. We heard a consistent statement or sentiment from council that for rent housing was really something to avoid at this property. That said, we also heard, council's desire to have Noonan be attractive to young people. And so just recently, just last November, the National Association for Realtors came out with the statement that the first-time home buyer, the average age of first-time home buyers is now 36. And that is, it's a smaller demographic and older than ever before. And so this is not saying, hey, y'all ought to consider rentals, and apartments should take over. But I think if council's interest is to attract younger folks to move back, between the years of college and 36, perhaps some for rent option might be something to explore. Our suggestion is that you look at it in a much different format than what I would say is the conventional garden apartment, the conventional large scale, 200 unit apartment buildings. We think, obviously consistent with the rest of the town here, these sort of missing middle buildings, a 4-plex, a 10-plex, a 12-plex, as a one-off or individual buildings, may be something to explore. Again, whether that's right for 57 East or not, but we heard both sort of the sentiment of the desire to avoid for rent, but also the interest in having younger folks come here. So perhaps there's a sort of happy medium there, and maybe a missing middle type of product, small scale, might be an option. Market demands is another thing we heard council members, stated a desire use for sort of a laundry list of everything. Could we get a hotel? Could we do a restaurant? Could we do office? Could we do for sale condos? A lot of things that are on there. They may or may not have private market interest, I think is what we see the challenge. So with a suggestion, we would consider, or we would ask the city to consider possibly, funding construction of some of the things themselves. Obviously, you all have thought of that as well. But we do think that, that the city can be a developer. And so potentially the city could, if some of those uses were of particular interest to the city and you didn't have a developer or market demand, you could consider taking that risk and actually, building what you desire. Next is a comment about incremental development. I think the sentiment and statement that having the design as in keeping with the scale of historic Noonan, one way to think about that is obviously simply just the facades and the aesthetics of the architecture. We also think about that in the block structure and the building structure, the building footprints. And so what we would say as a challenge is a 5.5 acre site is not a typical site. There is no 5.5 acre lot available on the 9 square grid of historic Noonan. So because of the size of the overall property, you could potentially therefore be attracting larger scale developers. And so we think that, considering building your own streets, building the public spaces, perhaps the public parking, the park, streets and sidewalks, that may result in smaller parcels that could be more attractive to what we would envision as an incremental developer, much more likely to build the incremental buildings and aesthetics that you all have identified as of interest. Design aesthetics, again and again, we heard how important the aesthetics were, how form over function and use was so important. We agree. We do think the current design guidelines that you have right now in our review of them is that they're heavily focused on existing buildings and sort of what to do with the existing buildings, and maybe less so on new buildings, new designs that are of high quality and authentic to Noonan. And then, the sort of enforcement of those design guidelines, I think, is another question that we would ask to look at, have you all kind of consider and look at a path forward. So a suggestion is the city could designate a role such as chief architect. We mentioned that a lot of private developers have a role of a quote-unquote town architect, where somebody is, a professional architect is actually there to assist with design matters, to interpret guidelines, and also, could potentially create the guidelines as well. or supplemental guidelines into the ones that you have right now, really focusing on new design, which obviously the 57 East Broad Street will all be new. The last piece was the convention center. Heard that again and again, that this was a real interest, that 57 East Broad could be a spot for the convention center. We do think the challenge there is that the one-story convention center might overwhelm the site. It might not be in keeping with the incremental development that you all had said and had interest in retaining. And so you're looking at how we could accommodate that, but possibly in a unique or different way than it is right now, is perhaps it would be a multi-story convention center, so that you could get a smaller footprint. It might be more vertical. The other option potentially is consider, partnering with a hotel developer, and, put the convention center on the ground floor or even on the penthouse of a small, boutique hotel. The opportunity to sort of blend those uses on the same footprint, but maybe at a slightly higher height, could be something that starts to fit into the block structure, I think, that we were seeing as more in keeping with the city. That really kind of concludes the wrap-up. The final pages that we have here are really just the appendix snapshot of the things that we reviewed together. It's sort of some of that background information of what you have on the property today. So what is downtown today. So, I think I'll spare you all the details of running through that. And with that, happy to open it up to any questions or criticisms or tomatoes.
Quick question, Kevin, one of the things that everything we've talked about here is above ground. We all know that site has a challenge, drainage, we've got infrastructure needs. How critical, from a timing perspective, is understanding what those infrastructure challenges are going to look like before we start laying over on top of it what we think, and then we can't because the infrastructure that we need to put in place to not to repair, but to actually accommodate those challenges that we have are there. So speak to that for a second, if you may.
Yeah, I would. I guess I would say it depends is probably the short answer, but but the real answer is that it really needs to start at the beginning. Leading with the recommendation of city building streets and sidewalks would be that you think about utilities, sort of campus wide on the full 5.5 acres. I think that is the smart approach. It would be very difficult, I think, to handle that at an individual site level or as a piecemeal approach.
Right. It has to be incorporate. It has to incorporate the entire site.
Yes.
The rain doesn't fall on just one section of it.
That's right.
We've got to do that. So is that something you recommend that's done right away, or how do we?
I don't think you can do it without having a development plan. So you really need a concept master plan in place, and that could be as simple as a master street plan where you have not identified what buildings or uses are, but you know where the streets are, which means you know how to handle the water, where the utilities are going to run. You could also develop if you have something other than a master street plan, you could have a development plan in concept and then do that. But I do think you have to have the concept in place before you could identify
The street layout and then the incremental parcels that you've been talking about.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Other questions from council? Anyone?
You guys did a great job, but I just want to maybe follow up with what the mayor said, as well as when the last slide that you showed us at the retreat, when it was kind of to me a drop the mic moment, when you kind of overlaid everything and quadrant off that particular development, and as you refer to different selling off those parcels, can you kind of focus in on that as to what the advantage of that would be to the city? Because it appeared to me at that particular moment it looked as that really had been the city for a long time. It just fit from the visual aspect of it from the top, and at a 30,000-foot view, it looked like it's been there. So can you help us understand that a little bit more or address it?
Yes, yeah, so the benefit of that is that so much of, I think, when we study places, they are made up of the block structure. That's what we feel. We may not know that, but that's what we feel when we walk in a city. We feel those intersections, and so yes, that's where we feel like starting with that block structure is the best way to put sort of the bones in the ground to say, here's how we're going to continue Noonan, or what Noonan historically is just to continue that grid and street structure as it has been. So that's sort of the first piece of it. The next piece of it, and I'll say maybe a con to it, is that it may limit your opportunities. You may end up with a developable site that may not be able to handle some larger use. Obviously, I think what we heard is perhaps a larger use isn't of interest. The 200-unit apartment complex may not be of interest. And so I think it starts to focus the development opportunity to things that are perhaps more in scale with, I think, what we were hearing council say will be attractive to downtown. The missing piece of it and a little bit of sort of fake, I don't know, I guess illusion that comes with this is that we just copy and pasted buildings that were built in the 18 and early 1900s, and they didn't have cars, and they didn't have trash, and they didn't have parking, and so you can still build that way. It is still possible to build that way, but it's different. It's probably not going to look exactly like what we've shown.
Right, understood. So we can't just expect it to be like that. But what you're describing to me is going to help us begin to narrow down exactly what we want. It's either going to be the site development as a whole, or are we going to parcel it out and make it really kind of unique? So that's going to put a line item through some of these things that we just discussed. That'd be fair to say? I'm talking to you. That's kind of what I'm sensing. It's going to help us narrow it. We either choose this kind of approach or we stay with the full site development.
I'm not sure what you're.
Well, what I'm saying is if we were to get the plan or the direction, if it were to be quadrant off in sections as he described, that will help us make a decision as to how it's going to be developed, as opposed to a convention center, a parking garage, and a hotel would be the whole site. It's going to be different and look uniquely different, and that approach would help us then redefine the direction, and it's going to put line items through things that can't be put on there. But that's what I'm getting at.
I think that this gives us, and pardon me for my tardiness, it gives us more than just two options. This actually gives us several more options, because you could, instead of having these additional, 6 blocks, you could turn this into a super block at the top and do some of the things that we talked about and have the rest as blocks. Or you could do any combination of that to get in some of the major things that we've been talking about and still have out parcels for us to work with. So there's so many more opportunities here. That's what I really love about this approach, is that we have been looking at this as one massive site that is really meant for the biggest, baddest thing we could find. Whereas breaking it down like this, it gives us many more options and many more ideas that we could sift through. And that's really, I think, the gold about this approach, is that we had not really thought about breaking it down in this way to give us this point of view.
Mr.
Cheryl?
Let's just play a what if. What if we said we want a hotel, we want a conference center, and then you got to have a parking deck? What's the footprint? I mean, if you went up as far as you could make it feasible, because you've got a big ballroom type thing and you've got certain things required. What's the footprint of that? How many acres? I mean, you only got 5.5 acres.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know offhand.
And you couldn't-
But I,
You couldn't put hardly anything else on that site, could you?
yeah, I think it depends. It depends on the scale of things. You know, perhaps I think the question is, can the streets define should the city define this space by streets and blocks? Or should they let a building and a use define the development of the space?
Why does it have to be either
Because you
or?
said it would, yeah?
Why does it have to be either or?
Because I think you could end up with a block that is outside of the normal scale for what you have in the rest of town.
All right, thank you.
Not that you can't do it, I'm sorry, but that
Sure.
it wouldn't be, it may not be in keeping with the rest of town.
I understand.
For a convention center, for example,
I mean,
I
go
mean,
up and.
obviously, as they explained, you're not gonna build a one-story convention center.
Right.
If you were to build one.
Yeah, you have-
You're gonna build a three-story type facility, and you're gonna have about 15,000 square feet, which is 1/3 of an acre.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, it looks big, but yeah, if you go 3-4 story product, yeah, your footprints are much smaller than you think. Yeah, I think
So what's the
I think if you were to build a hotel, parking deck, and a convention center, I still think you got half the site left, close to it.
Okay.
Yeah, and the typical block in Noonan is effectively 1 acre.
So then
It's-
if you did that, it wouldn't take up the whole thing, which would define how it really develops. You could still fit those in with some of the other pieces that you talked about.
Yes, yeah, again, totally program dependent, but as just sort of the quick math of, you know, the typical block in Noonan is 205 by 205. That's almost exactly an acre, 42,000 square feet. You know, if you think about the typical block in Noonan, it's really built out to the face of the block in all dimensions. Now, I don't know that you would have a 42,000 square foot footprint building, but you start to now imagine just the buildable footprint that you could have.
Mr. Alexander?
You know, we keep talking about a conference center, convention center, hotel, parking deck. I think one of the things I'd like to see is for us to do a feasibility study, if this is gonna work. I think there's a lot of positive to it, and the money the draw that it will bring, the economic impact to the city. But I think if we keep talking about a conference or a convention center, we need to do a feasibility study to see if it truly will work and what the professionals think we need to do. And same with the hotel.
And I think the convention authority is ready to step through that.
And I'm ready to
You gotta have the
send that to
hotel
them.
with it.
I agree. And I like the idea, but I think we need to send it to the convention authority and get this thing running. We need to start pulling the trigger and start making some decisions here, but that's one of my recommendations as we move forward.
You say pull the trigger, you're really saying find out what works.
Sure, yes, exactly. That's what
I
I'd like.
have one brief question, and that's regard to parking and off-street, and the street structure. I mean, are we talking about two-way streets or one-way streets, on-street parking or off-street?
Yeah, we highly recommend two-way streets and on-street parking
Okay.
as much as you can. That's gonna handle an awful lot of parking. Again, the city owning it means that it's parking for all, as opposed to an
Yeah.
individual business having to park everything on their property. There are a lot of studies out there about two-way streets and the value of two-way streets, both from a pedestrian safety standpoint, and vehicle speeds. So we
So it's
definitely recommend two-way streets.
speed control also.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Well, everybody else has talked about it, might as well, right? So, I guess could see, I like, I think that the whole rooftop vision and breaking it down kind of really struck a chord for us. It just opened up our eyes to think of other possibilities. It's just one massive project. And we talk about, building something, up, not necessarily exceeding six stories and something like that, just to fit with the character and nature. Something we could also consider is, you build up and then you can span a road. I mean, that gives us more floor space and, continuity. There's different ideas. I don't know how that would necessarily fit with what we have. We have, the church with the bridge kind of going over the road, and that's about it. But there are, a lot of possibilities out there. So I think we've got a whole lot to think about. Something and I know the convention center, is keen on this, but something we need to look at is, moving forward, is making sure that we don't leave the current Noonan Center and that property, having a plan for that as well. So it's well taken care of. It becomes it's not just left for something, just having a good plan for that as well.
Sure, understand. Well, you go back to the first page, or actually, yeah, page 1, where you started tonight. So we'll go back there to let you finish up there. And the first 2 steps there on the action items are solely this body. You need us to take those action items. The third step, though, is not in our skill set. So I assume it's in his historical concept skill set to develop the third item.
It absolutely is, as well as, a number of other architects
Sure.
or even, even marketing and brand professionals. As I said, you all have, I think you all have a lot of this already in place in terms of the value proposition. But I do think that, as we have seen, you really need to show it and illustrate it to people before they fully buy into it. Or you can wait and hope that they'll illustrate for you. But I think, I think the city driving the design is what we pretty consistently heard is what we think is best for you all to end up with what you want to see.
And then once we have a marketing document, it seems to be that number 2 is difficult to do until you determine how much the private sector is willing to step up and come to the plate as far as hotel. You mentioned in here selling off other parcels for other work. So 2 might change. We may say, well, our appetite is this, but then down the road, it may be well less than whatever that number is. Certainly wouldn't hope it would be higher, but because that would be the reason why we wouldn't have gotten a very good reception of our ideas.
Sure.
So 2 could change some depending on what reaction we get out of the market from 3. But number 1 is right on top of us, and we need to make sure that we address that issue in a formal fashion. And we're not here tonight. This is a work session to take a vote, obviously.
The reason why I do think number 2 might be important is because I think the city's determination on how much they would invest might tell you who is available or interested to purchase property after that. If the city is interested in essentially funding that role and playing that role of master developer, and when I say that, I'm thinking about the infrastructure, streets, sidewalks, utilities. The site needs a master developer.
Right.
And so if the city is willing to do that, then I think you now all of a sudden open up an opportunity to parcel off and sell off very small or very large parcels that are left over in between the blocks. So it's a wide variety of people that would be interested. If the city isn't interested in playing that master developer role, you'll have to go and find somebody who is interested in master developer role, which I think is sort of that large scale developer. We have seen, actually, I was just reminded of Woodstock, I believe, that did a very similar plan to this, which is that they put in effectively a master street plan just on paper only and did not develop it. But part of the development of those parcels that were developed by private people was that they were required to put in the infrastructure associated with their parcel. And so I think that might be an approach, and it might be worth talking to some folks from Woodstock to see how that's worked out as it relates to stormwater management and utilities. I think essentially it's sort of that they stub it out at the edge of their property where that street is going to eventually connect to a street and a block. moving forward. So it's possible that you could do it at a sort of paper level only, and then let that cost be borne by the actual developer.
So number 2 is also going to be determined by what the feasibility study comes back on the conference center.
That's right.
Convention center. So we have some items that we need to move forward on there. Could a marketing document be developed concurrently with our feasibility study for the conference center?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say yes. If, again, if the document was done in the way of sort of presenting an option to say, hey, here's what it would look like with a convention center. Here's what it would look like with a convention center and hotel. Here's what it would look like without one. I think any of those things could be on the table. But a scope, a draft program is something that would be sort of collaboratively developed before putting it together.
Comments, questions, anybody?
I've been involved for over 20 years in trying to get a conference center and a hotel. We finally got the conference center, but the only time we ever had the two together, the hotel people wanted the city to participate. And at that time, the city didn't. Later on, the city built the conference center without the hotel element. And gradually over time, it's a break even with some supplements we got to it. It's just, and we tried to get a hotel down there numerous times and see what the feasibility study, it can't get anybody. The fact that you have the conference center with the hotel, is that going to make that much difference to a developer so that they would look at it where we don't have to supplement their operations or guarantee things like that?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I would, potentially.
We can find out.
Maybe.
I think we'll find,
That'd be the feasibility study.
go ahead.
I'm just saying, every time I talk to the guy that was doing the feasibility study at the conference center, he would say the one out there, he said, it'll work, but I can't put it on paper because I can't support the numbers. And then every time you talk to hotel people around here, well, y'all got the highest occupancy with the lowest RevPAR there is, therefore we're not going to build a hotel in your place. So I just know that when we start doing that, we're going to run into those obstacles all over again. And, the city built the conference center and then the developer had to build the hotel, maybe so, but it's just a difficult thing to make it work. And as long as we understand that going in, that we may have to wind up making guarantees because we think it's going to work, but that's not on paper.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think the feasibility study will come out, and maybe one thing, I mean, I'm not the expert on it, but maybe it might be the location. This might be a better location, but I think we'll find out when the professionals, the experts come in and start looking at things. Plus, we're looking at a different time also.
I agree with Mr. Alexander.
Right now is not as good a time as it has been in the past.
I agree with Mr. Alexander on that. I think that a current feasibility study would be something that we should look at, and there are other factors at play here that may influence that study. So I think it would be prudent for us to look at it at least to see where we land on that.
Well, one of the things that there was some comments made related to, I think in the presentation you did in Thomasville, or I heard it somewhere, that Noonan was for a boutique hotel, or a hotel, was the third choice in the area. It wasn't the best choice. Like Sonoya, for example, was number one. If a large hotel or chain hotel were to come in, like a Hyatt or whatever, their first choice is not Noonan. So going to the feasibility study, part of my concern is and to what Rhodes was alluding to, is what are we going to have to give away in abatements, et cetera, and participation just to have what we think may work. So I hope part of what we're about to discover will ferret into that and really drill down to where we can go, as much as we would like it, it might not be the best thing.
We'll have to see what happens.
exactly.
We will.
Yep.
And we have to keep in mind what's happening with the site across the street.
Yeah, exactly. That's a huge influence.
The biggest.
Anyone else? Thank you, gentlemen. We
Thank you.
Appreciate being here. Staff have anything?
I guess maybe a little bit of clarity on Councilman Alexander's request for the feasibility. Do we want to actually formally ask the Convention Center Authority to proceed with that, complete that? I know they've been doing a little bit of legwork in preparation of potentially the request coming, but do you think it's something they need to simply handle themselves to present their?
Well, can I ask a question?
I mean, I think they know
Would
more
that be-
about it than we do.
It seems to me, I wouldn't want to put it in their hands. I would rather have somebody that, because I think,
They would use an outside.
I mean, they would engage.
they would use it outside, but I don't think they should be the sole. If that's what you're saying.
No,
they're
I'm
gonna
not,
use
I'm
outside.
asking, they would hold the contract for the professional consultant feasibility study is what they would do. They're not performing that particular work themselves.
And I like that idea of
I
them
think
having a
If
contract.
you're concerned about it, Paul, let them tell us who they're gonna use and what they're gonna cost.
No, I thought that
the
they would do the study. That's what I was concerned about.
No,
They would hire a pro to do the study.
Well, see,
Their authority would put together an RFP just like we would.
okay.
It would go out, they'd have responses,
We may have to pay for it.
Yes.
Well, of course.
We ask for it. Right?
So we can't make a decision. I won't even ask for a consensus here at the 5 o'clock meeting, but when we go into our 6:30 meeting, we've had a work session. And if you would like to stand up again during your section, or if I want to bring it up during mine, to go ahead and get a consensus from the group as to how the direction we would like them to move, then I think we can do that tonight, if that's okay. Everyone? Okay. All right. Anything else for the good of the order? Then I'll entertain a motion that we adjourn from this work session.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second, we adjourn from the work session. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, we're adjourned. Our regular meeting starts at 6:30.